The rain outside the Atlas Manor did not fall so much as it congealed against the high, arched windows. It was a cold, expensive kind of evening, the sort where the logs in the hearth popped on cue and the silver stayed bright without polishing. At the center of the drawing room stood 7-year-old Leo. He was small, his coat 3 sizes too large, his fingers tucked raw into his pockets. He smelled of public transit and municipal detergent, a jarring contrast to the cedarwood and beeswax of the estate. The Atlas family sat across from him on velvet highbacks, looking less like a welcoming committee and more like an art committee, evaluating a slightly flawed sculpture. They had taken him from the regional orphanage that afternoon, a calculated public relations maneuver designed to soften the patriarch's reputation before the upcoming winter election cycle. When Leo's scuffed leather shoe pressed into the deep pile of the Persian rug, he didn't make a sound. He simply looked down at his feet, his shoulder blades sharp beneath his thin shirt. But beneath his ribs, something heavy and ancient shifted. A sharp, microscopic chime rang out, completely silent to the human ear. In Leo's immediate field of vision, the dim yellow light of the drawing room desaturated into a crisp, clinical gray. Thin lines of luminous blue text began to weave themselves through the air, snapping into place above the heads of his new guardians. System initialization, Atlas Family Prosperity Contract. Host designation, Leo. Target entity, the Atlas lineage. Active protocol, conglomerate prosperity aura. Current status, locked at permanent plus 100%. The text lingered for 3 heartbeats, casting a pale glow across the boy's unblinking eyes, before dissolving back into the ambient light of the room. The color rushed back, the fire crackled louder. The family felt nothing. They didn't feel the sudden, permanent stabilization of the local atmospheric pressure, nor did they notice that the slight rattle in the manor's eastern radiator had instantly ceased. They only saw a quiet, submissive boy who knew how to keep his head down. "He'll do," the father said, not looking up from his scotch. "Get him washed. The house staff doesn't have time to clean up after mud." That was the exact hour the universe began to cheat on their behalf. Within 6 months, the baseline luck of the Atlas family became an absolute, unshakable law of nature. It operated so flawlessly that it quickly became invisible, a background radiation of constant victory that the family mistook for personal genius. When the father made a reckless, late-night speculative investment in a failing maritime shipping firm, a blunder that should have liquidated their liquid capital, a sudden, unprecedented labor strike in an overseas port rerouted the entire global supply chain directly through his newly acquired docks. The disaster became a $40 million windfall before the weekend. When Victoria, at age 14, miscalculated the entire quarterly routing logic for the family's domestic freight line, an anomalous software glitch at the regional sorting facility accidentally optimized the routes anyway, cutting fuel costs by 30%. Her parents praised her analytical discipline at dinner. She simply smiled, convinced her mind worked differently than the rest of the world. They grew up in a world without friction. They became accustomed to the idea that the wind always blew in their sails because they were inherently, genetically superior. They treated life like a story written specifically to serve their names, completely blind to the reality-warping architecture operating silently from the small desk in Leo's corner. Leo became a natural fixture of their landscape, as permanent and unacknowledged as the load-bearing pillars in the cellar. He was the boy who checked the logs, the boy who stayed up until 2 a.m. adjusting invoices, the boy who never asked for clothes that weren't Julian's hand-me-downs. They walked through the house completely unaware that every step they took on solid ground was being paid for by a child who was holding up the sky with both hands, his personal system balance locked at a humble $5,000 while theirs grew by millions. They had forgotten what a normal world felt like. They had forgotten that actions have consequences, that bad choices lose fortunes, and that gravity eventually pulls everything down. And most catastrophically of all, they believed they could discard the quiet boy in the corner without ever checking what was keeping the roof from falling. The transition from childhood to labor happened without an official announcement. By the time Leo was 8, he had already learned that the Atlas household was a machine that ran on an unwritten language of performance and omission. You did not ask for space. You occupied the gaps left by others. His 8th birthday fell on a Tuesday, deep in the absolute choke of the November rains. The manor was quiet, the parents away at a charity gala in the city, and the house staff had already retreated to their quarters in the western wing. Leo sat alone at the long, dark mahogany island in the kitchen, his small legs dangling inches above the tiled floor. The clock on the oven read 11:54 p.m. He was not crying, he was simply waiting, his small hands wrapped around a glass of tap water, watching the digital numbers click closer to the line where one day bled into the next. He didn't expect a cake or a song. His system parameters had already trained him to understand that his birthday was an administrative footnote, not an event. At exactly 11:58, the heavy swinging door to the kitchen creaked open. Leo stiffened, pulling his chin down into the collar of his faded gray sweater. It was Mia. She was 6 then, her hair tangled from sleep, dragging a stuffed bear by its arm. She didn't look at Leo. Not really, her half-shut eyes entirely focused on the refrigerator. She was looking for juice, her small feet padding softly across the cold slate. She found a paper plate on the middle shelf instead. It held the dense, crushed remains of a manila cupcake left over from a school party she had attended that afternoon. She pulled it out, took 2 absent-minded bites of the frosting, and then stopped, her small brow furrowing as if the sweetness had suddenly offended her midnight palate. Turning toward the sink to wash her hands, her eyes finally brushed past Leo sitting in the shadows of the island. "Here," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. She shoved the remaining half of the paper plate across the counter toward him, not out of kindness, but simply because the trash can was 3 steps further than the boy. "Happy birthday or whatever, Leo." She didn't wait for a response. She abandoned her glass of water, turned on her heel, and dragged her bear back through the swinging doors, leaving the kitchen completely silent once more. The digital clock clicked to 12 a.m. Leo looked down at the crumpled paper plate. The cupcake was torn unevenly, the vanilla sponge leaking a few yellow crumbs onto the mahogany. Mia had forgotten she had even spoken to him before her feet hit the stairs. By sunrise, the memory would be completely erased from her mind, replaced by the louder, brighter details of her own life. But Leo did not move. He picked up the dry half of the cake with trembling fingers and chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty doorway. To a starving child, a single crumb is a feast. He didn't see the careless shrug or the casual indifference of a sleepy 6-year-old. His mind, desperate for anchor, registered the encounter as a sacred pact. She called me her brother, he thought, the words settling into his chest like hot lead. I'm going to protect her forever. I will make sure she never has to cry. The blue text box of his interface blinked once in the dark corner of his vision, recording the baseline emotional imprint. System note, core attachment anchor established. Integrity level, maximum. He kept that half-eaten cake inside his head for 15 years, using it to warm himself every time the house grew cold, entirely unaware that he was building an empire on a foundation of dust. The crumbs sufficed for 3 more winters, until the month Leo turned 11. Hotless Corp's secondary domestic distribution hub had fallen into a state of absolute multi-million-dollar gridlock. A sudden regional rail strike had stranded 40 tons of high-priority freight in the middle of the winter rush, and the logistics software, which Julian had casually tinkered with to impress his private tutors, had crashed under the weight of the rerouting queues. For 12 consecutive days, 11-year-old Leo lived in the back of the logistics terminal. He slept on a pile of flattened shipping boxes behind the main mainframe racks, his face smudged with toner and dust. His fingers, small and nimble, flew across the terminal keys, manually rewriting the sorting scripts and cross-referencing manifests by hand while the corporate executives panicked in their high-backed chairs. He didn't do it because the system ordered him to. He did it because every evening he could hear his father's heavy, stressful footsteps pacing the floorboards above the basement office. On the 13th morning, the gridlock broke. The cargo moved. The company's stock value, which had been teetering on a dangerous cliff, surged by 12% before the opening bell. The patriarch walked through the terminal that afternoon, flanked by 3 vice presidents and his personal legal team. He was laughing, his chest puffed out, basking in the sudden miraculous recovery that the local papers were already calling a stroke of veteran corporate intuition. As the entourage swept past the lower sorting bays, the father's eyes accidentally fell upon Leo. The boy was standing by a pallet jack, his clothes reeking of grease, his eyes bloodshot and heavy from 48 hours without sleep. The father stopped. The vice presidents stopped behind him like a line of dominoes. For 3 seconds, the man looked at the small, grimy boy who had spent 2 weeks doing the work of an entire technical department. A rare, uncalculated impulse crossed the patriarch's face. He reached out, his heavy, gold-ringed hand coming down in a brief, casual pat against Leo's small shoulder. "Good job today, son. the father said, his voice booming with the easy warmth of a man who had just made $5 million. He didn't wait for Leo to answer. He turned back to his executives, already speaking about his weekend tea time at the country club, his hand leaving Leo's shoulder as quickly as it had arrived. The father never repeated the phrase. He never checked to see if the boy had eaten, and within 20 minutes, he had completely forgotten he had ever uttered the word son in that damp warehouse. But Leo stood frozen by the pallet jack for an hour, his hand pressed against the spot on his jacket where his father's palm had rested. The sentence became a fortune. For the next 13 years, whenever Victoria took credit for his analytical strategies, or whenever Chloe screamed at him for spoiling her aesthetic with his presence, Leo would reach deep into his memory and pull out those 5 words. Good job today, son. He would polish them in the dark, using them to convince himself that he was staying for something real, completely blind to the fact that he was surviving on a single drop of rain in a desert that would never end. By the time he was 17, the crumbs had become the only currency he knew how to count. The letter had arrived in a plain white envelope, completely unstamped, delivered by a private courier from the French consulate. It was a formal, unconditional acceptance into the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, a fully funded 7-year architecture fellowship that had been awarded to only 3 individuals globally that year. Leo had submitted his blueprints under a pseudonym, working on the intricate, sweeping structural designs between midnight and 4 in the morning while the rest of the manor slept. It was his exit. It was a life of light and stone, a world where things stayed where you built them, far away from the shifting, ungrateful gravity of the Atlas estate. He kept the letter folded in his breast pocket all day, his heart beating a frantic, terrifying rhythm against the paper. He intended to tell them at dinner. He had even rehearsed the words, practicing how he would explain that the company's logistics were now fully automated, that they didn't need his hands on the keyboard anymore. The dinner was a lavish affair celebrating Victoria's acceptance into a prestigious local business society. The table was crowded with crystal and heavy silver, the conversation loud with the family's usual unshakable confidence. Near the end of the meal, as the dessert plates were being cleared, the mother reached across the table. Her fingers didn't touch Leo's, but she looked at him with a soft, rare smile, the kind of look she usually reserved for a reliable piece of machinery that had handled a difficult winter without breaking. "I was just telling your father today, Leo," the mother said, her voice smooth and comforting. "I don't know what we'd do without you keeping things running around here. You're our steady anchor, especially now with Julian starting his prep courses. It gives us such peace of mind knowing you're always in the background." The family nodded in unison, a casual collective agreement that passed over the table like a warm breeze. Julian didn't look up from his phone, and Mia was already complaining about the fruit tart, but for that 1 second, the entire room felt safe. Leo's hand went to his breast pocket, his fingers pressing against the sharp edge of the French consulate's letter. He looked at the mother's smile. He looked at the father's relaxed posture. He felt a sudden, devastating surge of gratitude, a profound, terrifying belief that this was what a family felt like. They needed him. They trusted him. He wasn't just a shadow. He was their anchor. He closed his eyes, his chest tightening until it hurt. That night, alone in his room, Leo did not pack a bag. He did not call the consulate. He walked to the small brick fireplace in the corner of his bedroom, struck a single match, and held the acceptance letter over the flame until the corners curled into black ash. He watched his true dream turn into gray smoke, smiling into the dark as he threw the remains into the grate. He traded his entire future for a single sentence of casual validation, completely unaware that an anchor is only useful to the ship until it's time to sail, and then it's left at the bottom of the sea. The boy who burned his letters died on his 24th birthday. It was 11:55 p.m., and the kitchen was exactly as it had been 16 years prior, dark, cold, and smelling slightly of rain. Leo sat at the counter, a single small vanilla cupcake from the bakery down the street sitting on a paper towel before him. He hadn't bought it to eat. He had bought it out of habit, a mechanical continuation of a ritual that had long since lost its magic. At 11:57 p.m., a low, hesitant scraping sound came from the gravel driveway outside the side gate. Leo rose quietly, his movements fluid and soundless, and stepped out into the damp courtyard. The rain was thin, a miserable mist that clung to the ivy. Standing on the other side of the wrought iron gate was Nanny Martha. She was nearly 70 now, her joints swollen from the dampness, her old wool coat soaked through at the shoulders. The parents had dismissed her 3 years ago, claiming her old-fashioned methods were cluttering the estate's staff hierarchy, but she had ridden 2 buses in the dark just to stand by the hedge. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracked and trembling as she reached her thin, calloused hands through the iron bars. "I couldn't stay long. The guards, I know your mother doesn't want me on the property." In her palms lay a pair of hand-knitted wool gloves, the stitch uneven, the yarn a cheap, bright blue. Leo took her hands, his skin shockingly smooth against her worn palms. He didn't look at the gloves. He looked at her face, at the small, genuine lines of worry around her eyes. She was the only person in the city who knew what date it was. She was the only one who didn't want him to fix a server or sign a shipping manifest. "Thank you, Martha," Leo said softly, his voice catching in his throat. "You shouldn't have come out in this weather." "You're a good boy, Leo," she mumbled, patting his fingers before pulling away into the mist, her old umbrella wobbling as she disappeared down the dark lane. "Don't let them freeze you out." Leo stood by the gate for a long time, the damp wool gloves clutched against his chest. He didn't feel the cold. He felt a strange, hollow clearing in his mind, like a room where all the furniture had suddenly been carried away. He walked back inside through the side entrance, his wet shoes silent on the parquet. As he passed the long, shadow-drenched corridor leading to the library, the heavy oak doors were cracked open, a sliver of warm, amber light spilling across the floorboards. "Julian's transit logistics numbers are still soft," the father's voice drifted out, practical and dry. "He doesn't have the stomach for the raw data yet. We may need to delay his public appointment to the vice presidency by another quarter." "We can't delay it," the mother replied, her voice entirely casual, the tone she used when discussing the seasonal rotation of the garden beds. "The board expects the biological succession this winter. Leo can simply handle the operational transition from the back office. He's handled the labor flawlessly for years." "And if Leo objects?" the father asked, a slight chuckle in his throat. "He's been running that entire division under his own name since he was 20. If we strip the title and hand it to Julian, he might finally realize his leverage." The mother let out a soft, dismissive sigh, the sound of ice shifting in her glass. "Object? Where would he go, dear? Let's be realistic. He isn't really our son. He knows his place. He'll stay and do the work because he has nowhere else to turn. He's completely desperate for this family. He's spent his whole life begging for a seat at the table. He won't walk away now over a title." Outside in the dark corridor, Leo did not move. He did not ball his fists. He did not feel the sudden hot rush of adrenaline that precedes a confrontation. He looked down at the bright blue wool gloves in his hand. Then he looked through the crack in the door at the 2 people he had spent 10,000 days trying to buy with his life. The fragile, starving boy who had hoarded half a cupcake at 8 years old, who had collected 5 words of praise at 11, who had burned his future at 17, that boy simply turned around and walked away. He didn't die with a scream. He died with a quiet internal click, like a lock turning in an empty house. He returned to the kitchen counter. The clock read 12:02 a.m. His birthday had arrived and passed in absolute, unblemished silence. Leo picked up a match, struck it against the box, and lit the small white candle stuck into the vanilla cupcake. He didn't make a wish. He didn't look at the flame. He sat perfectly still for 30 seconds, watching the wax drip onto the paper towel, his face entirely expression-jerseyed in the dark. Then, with a single short breath, he blew the candle out. Without a sound, he picked up the cupcake, walked over to the stainless steel trash can beneath the sink, and dropped it directly into the garbage, entirely untouched. He was done waiting. In his field of vision, the dim blue text of the system flared to life, a small rhythmic chime vibrating in his mind. Critical prompt. Contract closure initiated. Time remaining, 500 days. Action required. Select early termination. Yes. No. Leo looked at the glowing buttons. He reached out his hand, his finger hovering over the interface. He didn't press yes. No, he thought, his mind turning beautifully, terrifyingly cold. I want them to have every single second of the luck they think they earned. I want them to build their towers higher. I want Victoria to believe she is a god, Chloe to think she is untouchable, and Julian to take my desk. I will stay until the very last hour. And then I will let go. He tapped nitrogen monoxide, closed the interface, and walked back to his room in the dark, his heart completely silent. The top floor of the Atlas Tower was a fortress of glass and brushed titanium, designed specifically to overlook the city they believed they owned. On this morning, the sky outside was a bleached, indifferent white. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy. At the end of the long boardroom table sat the patriarch, flanked by Victoria and Julian. Across from them stood Leo, his worn wool coat thrown over his arm, looking exactly like a man waiting for a train that was already delayed. In the corner, Chloe held her phone at a precise 45-degree angle. The red recording light bounced off her diamond earrings. Her screen was a cascading blur of live chat comments, thousands of viewers tuning into what she had titled The Purge, cleaning out corporate parasites live. "We know what you did, Leo." Julian broke the silence, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his own performance. He slammed a heavy leather folder onto the glass table. The data leaks from the logistics sector, the proprietary shipping scripts sold to our competitors. We have the digital footprint. Julian's knuckles were white. He had spent the last 3 days meticulously falsifying those logs, driven by a desperate, sweating need to erase the reality that he couldn't even run a basic sorting query without Leo's automation scripts. Beside him, Mia sat with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed with the hollow triumph of someone who had read too many stories. For months, her mind had been consumed by the intricate, fictionalized web novel plots she devoured online, narratives of hidden vipers and adopted brothers plotting to usurp the true bloodline. "You always acted so quiet, so submissive," she said, her voice dripping with dramatic satisfaction. "But the quiet ones are always the ones trying to steal the crown." Leo looked at her. For a fleeting second, his mind flickered back to a kitchen counter, to a paper plate and a half-eaten vanilla cupcake. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It was just a cold, dead specimen under glass. Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking like small pistol shots against the marble border. She dropped a clinical 100-page financial audit directly in front of Leo. "Your access to all corporate servers was terminated at midnight," she stated, her tone flat and devoid of human warmth. "The audit shows a discrepancy of $50,000 in the discretionary technical fund. We could prosecute. We could dismantle your name entirely." She paused, looking for a flinch, a tremor, a single sign of panic. Leo did not move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes drifting over the blue text that was currently tracking across his vision, visible only to him. "System countdown. Prosperity contract closure. Time remaining. 00 hours. 02 minutes, 14 seconds. Integrity anchor status. Broken. Current extraction state. Preparing for aura recoil." "However," Victoria continued, sliding a single sheet of paper and a sleek silver pen across the table, "out of respect for our parents' charity, we are offering you a clean break. Sign the severance. Waiver all future claims against Atlas Corp., and we will not involve the authorities." Beside the contract lay a paper check. It was for $50,000, the exact amount they had accused him of stealing. It was a calculated insult, a financial crumb meant to ensure he left with his head down. The live chat on Chloe's phone was losing its mind. "Is he going to cry? Look at his clothes. He looks like a beggar. Serves him right for trying to snake a family like the Vances." Leo reached out and picked up the silver pen. His hand was entirely steady. The tranquility radiating from him was so absolute, so unearthly, that the patriarch's grip tightened around his armrest. The old man had expected a plea, a breakdown, perhaps a desperate reminder of the nights Leo had spent saving their logistics hub from ruin. Instead, Leo simply signed his name at the bottom of the page with a clean, elegant stroke. He picked up the $50,000 check, folded it precisely in half, and slid it into his breast pocket. "Is that all?" Leo asked softly. Julian let out a nervous, mocking laugh. "That's it, brother. You can take your little check and see how far the Atlas name carries you when you're outside these walls." Leo didn't answer. He turned on his heel and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. His footsteps made no sound. At exactly the moment his hand touched the stainless steel handle of the exit, the digital clock on the wall clicked to 10 a.m. The 10,000th day had ended. A massive, deep-toned chime echoed directly inside Leo's skull, followed by a violent, rushing sound like a vacuum opening in the center of the room. The air in the boardroom suddenly felt thin, cold, and entirely stripped of its artificial sweetness. "Contract completion, 10,000 days fulfilled. Protocol, conglomerate prosperity aura. Successful extraction. Target lineage status resetting to natural default. Atlas family luck coefficient minus 50%. The family felt a sudden physical jolt. It wasn't a pain, but a terrifying lightness, as if the invisible pillars holding up their lives had suddenly vanished through the floorboards. Chloe's phone went dead first. The screen went completely black, the battery instantly draining from 90% to 0 in a fraction of a second. "What the? My stream," she muttered, tapping the glass frantically. Outside the window, a low, ominous rumble rolled across the city. The pale white sky was rapidly turning the color of wet iron. Before Leo could step into the elevator, the system HUD flared to life one final time, its text no longer blue, but a brilliant, regal gold that seemed to illuminate the entire corridor. Final disbursement. System reward unlocked. Mission parameter. Endure and stabilize. Reward generated, 100% core equity of the Sterling conglomerate. Note, transfer of ownership finalized at 10 a.m. All global subsidiaries have been notified. Leo stepped into the elevator. As the silver doors began to slide shut, he looked back through the glass partitions of the boardroom. He saw Victoria frantically answering her desk phone, her face turning an ash gray as the first corporate anomaly registered. He saw the patriarch spill his scotch onto his tailored trousers as the ice in his glass cracked cleanly in two. He saw Julian staring at his laptop, watching the lines of code Leo had written for 15 years begin to collapse into unreadable, corrupted syntax. The elevator doors clicked closed, sealing them in their new unprotected universe. Leo walked out of the ground floor lobby and stepped through the revolving doors into the crisp morning air. For the first time in 10,000 days, the sky above him didn't feel heavy. The rain did not fall on him. It parted around his coat like a quiet sign of respect. He didn't look back at the tower. He simply pulled his hands into his pockets, felt the cheap wool gloves Martha had knitted for him, and walked into the sunlight. The descent did not begin with a catastrophic crash. It began with the quiet structural groan of a house that had forgotten how to stand on its own. Within 48 hours of Leo's departure, the frictionless world the Vances had inhabited for a decade vanished. The market, which had spent 10 years accommodating Victoria's analytical errors, suddenly became a cold mathematical wilderness. By the third month, the bleeding was total. Victoria sat alone in the dim corporate archive room of the Atlas Tower, the floor around her desk buried under a snowdrift of red-lined ledgers and emergency liquidity demands. The company had just lost $22 million in an unshielded European expansion, a strategy she had proudly designed herself, completely confident that her baseline intuition would turn the high-risk gamble into a legendary victory. Instead, the regulatory boards had hit them without mercy. The shipping lanes had closed, the luck had run out. Desperate to find a historical precedent for how they had easily survived past recessions, Victoria manually bypassed the encryption keys on the company's master server. Her fingers were stiff, her hair pulled back into a messy, unwashed knot. She wasn't looking for Leo. She was looking for her own past genius to copy. She found a hidden subdirectory instead. It was labeled under a dead student identification number from 15 years ago. When the files clicked open, the blue light of the monitor reflected across her hollow, bloodshot eyes. She didn't find fraudulent transactions or embezzled funds. She found the raw, unedited master files for the National Commerce Excellence Strategy, the very achievement that had put her on the cover of every financial magazine in the city. The timestamp on the master code was dated 3 months before she had even conceived the presentation. Victoria stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat. She scrolled down, her mouse clicking frantically through thousands of lines of syntax. Embedded in every single corporate windfall, every miraculous recovery, and every supply chain optimization over the last decade was a silent, automated script written from Leo's old terminal. Whenever she had made a calculation error, Leo's software had quietly intercepted the manifest, rerouted the cargo, and manually adjusted the volatile fuel margins in the dark to ensure her public spreadsheets always looked flawless. "I didn't build this," Victoria whispered into the empty archive room. Her hand fell away from the mouse, dropping heavily onto the desk. She looked at her hands, the hands that had held glass trophies and signed eviction notices. She wasn't a corporate prodigy. She wasn't an analytical giant. She was an intellectual ghost, a figurehead who had been allowed to play executive in a sandbox carefully leveled by a child she had called a parasite. 2 floors below, Chloe sat in her private studio, the silence around her so thick it felt physical. The studio's ring light sat dark in the corner, its white circle casting a pale, dead shadow across the vanity. Her phone lay flat on the marble counter, its screen dark. Every 40 seconds, it would vibrate once, not with notifications or sponsorship contracts, but with the legal notices of brands terminating her representation for public relations liabilities. The unedited boardroom stream had leaked. Without the system's automatic algorithmic dampening, the public reaction to her exile live had been savage and immediate. The hashtag Justice for Leo had dismantled her brand in 72 hours, but the true break didn't come from the internet. It came from a physical folder left on her vanity by a disgruntled, departing human resources manager. Inside the folder were the internal payroll sheets from the great market dip of 2024. Chloe remembered that winter clearly. It was the year she had demanded a $5 million global lifestyle branding campaign in Paris to cement her status as a high society tastemaker. She had always boasted to her followers that her sheer aesthetic brilliance had generated enough traffic to keep the company's warehouse staff employed during the freeze. But the bank receipts in her hand told a different story. The corporate payroll for those 300 warehouse workers had been entirely short that winter. The missing funds hadn't come from a commercial loan or a corporate reserve. They had been transferred directly from a private, low-yield account labeled Leo Personal Stipend. Leo had secretly emptied his own 10-year savings down to the last dollar, living on instant noodles and sleeping on his office couch for 4 months, entirely so the warehouse families wouldn't miss a paycheck, and so Chloe wouldn't face public scandal for her vanity project. He covered it, Chloe stammered, her voice dropping into the empty, luxurious room. She looked in the mirror, but she couldn't see herself anymore. She could only see the boy who had stayed out of her videos because she told him his cheap suits ruined her background aesthetic. She had publicly exiled the only person who had ever protected her from her own greed, and she had done it for clicks that were already gone. At the Atlas Manor, the twilight fell through the dusty windows of the attic like gray water. The estate was under a federal foreclosure freeze, the grand hallways downstairs packed with cardboard boxes and taped furniture. Mia sat alone on an overturned crate in the corner of the rafters, her knees pulled tight against her chest. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming. In her lap lay a small, leather-bound childhood journal she had pulled from a box of discarded papers near the chimney. The pages were yellowed, the edges curled by the humidity of 20 winters. The handwriting inside was neat, precise, and small. The script of a boy who didn't want to use up too much paper. Mia's thumb rested against an entry dated from 16 years ago. November 14th. Mia gave me half her cupcake tonight. She called me her brother. I'm going to protect her forever. I will make sure she never has to cry. Mia stared at the ink. The dust motes floated around her head in the dimming light, completely still. She didn't move her legs. She didn't turn the page. Her mind, usually so loud with the dramatic, self-authored narratives of high society rivalry, fell into a terrifying, bottomless quiet. She remembered the party. She remembered the cupcake. She remembered how she had completely forgotten about it by the next morning, treating it like a piece of trash she had handed to the boy in the dark kitchen. She had spent 12 years treating him like an invading snake, an adoptive parasite who was trying to steal her family's affection, and the entire time, his whole existence had been anchored to a promise made over a half-eaten piece of cake she hadn't even meant to give him. The sun went down completely, the attic turned pitch black, the shapes of the storage boxes dissolving into the shadows. The hours crawled past. When the first pale light of dawn crept back through the circular attic window, illuminating the gray dust on her shoes, Mia was still sitting on the crate. Her eyes were still wide, unblinking, fixed entirely on that single paragraph of ink. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She was simply devastated, hollowed out by the quiet weight of a devotion she had systematically tortured until it died. In the master study on the ground floor, the parents sat across from each other at the massive mahogany desk. The room smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the decanter of scotch sitting empty between them. They had spent the night going through the physical estate records, preparing for the upcoming asset liquidation before the bankruptcy court. The father had been looking for hidden deeds, for some forgotten piece of collateral Leo might have stashed away during his tenure. Instead, they found his room. They had gone into the small, narrow space over the western garage, a room they hadn't stepped into since Leo was 12. They had entered expecting to find the typical remnants of a young man's life: books, travel brochures, personal mementos, perhaps an architectural design draft, or a hidden folder of personal plans. They found nothing. The bed was made with a single, coarse gray blanket that had been issued to him at the orphanage 19 years ago. The desk was bare, except for a neat, towering stack of company logistics logs, organized flawlessly by date from 2016 to the present day. There were no posters on the walls, no personal photographs on the dresser, no architecture books, no hobbies, no trace that a living, breathing human being with desires and dreams had ever occupied the space for 17 years. The father held a single financial ledger in his hands, his old fingers trembling slightly against the leather binding. For nearly 2 decades, they had paid Leo a meager, basic administrative stipend, assuming he was hoarding it or using the Atlas name to secure private accounts. But the ledger showed a single, recurring transaction under his name. Every year, on the exact same date, there was only one expense recorded, one individual vanilla cupcake. Local bakery, $3.50. No other purchases, no clothes, no jewelry, no celebrations. The mother looked up from the desk, her face pale, her lips parted as the silence of the manor seemed to press against her ears. The realization didn't come with an explanation. It landed like a suffocating stone in the center of the room. They hadn't raised a son. They hadn't even mistreated one. They had consumed him. They had taken a child from the dirt, placed him in a corner, and allowed him to spend 17 years paying for his right to exist by giving them his youth, his intellect, and his silence. The cupcake wasn't a dessert. It was the only birthday memory he had ever been given, and he had spent his entire life trying to recreate it in the dark while they lived like kings on his shadow. The father closed the ledger, the sound low and heavy in the quiet study. He looked at his wife, but neither of them could look each other in the eye. The house was entirely empty, and the bill had finally come due. The lobby of Sterling Tower was a vast, unforgiving expanse of white quartzite and absolute stillness. It did not possess the dark, heavy mahogany of the old Atlas estate. It possessed the cold, clean geometry of a future that didn't care about lineage. The Atlas family arrived on foot. The luxury sedans had been repossessed by the bank on Tuesday morning, and their private drivers had long since vanished to find solvent employers. They walked through the glass revolving doors with their heads down, their expensive tailored coats damp from the morning mist, looking entirely out of place beneath the towering atrium. The security guards didn't pull their batons or raise their voices. They simply watched the family with a quiet, devastating recognition. The receptionist stopped typing, their eyes tracking the disgraced social royalty as they moved toward the express elevator like ghosts shuffling through a museum. Leo stood by the window, his back to them. The transformation was not physical. He still wore a simple, unbranded charcoal suit, but the architecture of his body had fundamentally changed. The heavy, tentative posture of the quiet adopted son was entirely gone. His shoulders were loose, his hands resting lightly in his pockets, his silhouette cutting a clean, unshakable line against the morning sky. He looked serene, detached, and utterly free. The family huddled near the entrance of the office, their breathing shallow and ragged against the silence. Victoria stood with her chin pressed into her collar, her eyes fixed on the reflective marble floor. The brilliant CFO could not bring herself to look at the man who had ghostwritten her entire life. Beside her, Chloe stared at her own leather boots, her hands tucked deep into her pockets to hide the trembling. Mia stepped forward first, her movements slow and mechanical. Her fingers were white, clutching the old, dusty leather journal she had carried down from the attic. She looked up at Leo's back, her bloodshot eyes pleading for something, an accusation, a scream, a torrent of righteous anger, anything but the suffocating peace that filled the room. Julian broke first, his face bloodless and hollowed out by 3 days of pending federal indictments and frozen accounts. "You planned this," he whispered, his voice thin and desperate in the massive room. "The logistics, scripts, the market shorting. You knew exactly how hard we would fall. You must hate us. You must have hated us for years." Leo did not turn around. He didn't even shift his weight. "I don't hate you, Julian," he said softly, his voice echoing cleanly off the glass. "Hate requires emotional real estate. It requires an investment of self." He paused, looking out at the city. "You wanted my desk. You wanted the title, the vice presidency, and the inheritance. You have them." Julian fell back half a step, his mouth opening slightly but formatting no words. He had received exactly what he had fought for, and it had destroyed him in less than 90 days because the subsidized safety net had vanished. Father stepped forward then, his posture stooped, his voice completely hollow and shaking as he reached his old hands out toward the space between them. Leo, we went into your room. We went over the garage. We saw the logs. We saw the bakery receipts. The old man's voice cracked, the sound wet and pathetic. There was nothing there. There was nothing of you in that room. No books, no photos, nothing. The family braced themselves. They pulled their shoulders tight, preparing for the lecture they knew they deserved. They waited for him to list their sins, to bring up the freezing miles in the rain, the days spent beside the hospital bed, the years of taking credit for his mind, and the final, brutal exile in the boardroom. They wanted him to tell them how much they had hurt him. Leo finally turned to face them. His expression was entirely peaceful. His eyes were clear, dark, and perfectly still, the look of a man watching strangers through a thick pane of triple-glazed glass. He didn't look at them with malice, or with the twisted joy of a victor. He looked at them as if they were a landscape he had passed through years ago. You already know, Leo said softly. The 5 words landed in the center of the penthouse with absolute, crushing finality. There was no need for an explanation. The weight of the archive files was already there. The weight of the warehouse payroll was already there. The text in the attic journal was already there. The 17 vanilla cupcakes were already there. Victoria knew. Chloe knows. Mia knows. The parents know. The silence in the room became so heavy that the mother let out a soft, choked sob, covering her face with her damp hands. She stepped forward, her tears spilling over her manicured fingers, her voice cracking with an agonizing, desperate question that had haunted her since the manor doors were locked. When did we lose you, Leo? When did you stop being our son? Leo looked at her. He didn't flinch. His voice remained entirely level, completely devoid of poison, as he delivered the final, devastating truth of their 10,000 days. You didn't, Leo answered softly. The mother blinked through her tears, her hands dropping away from her face, her expression entirely confused. I stayed until the end, Leo said, his voice dropping to a gentle whisper. The realization completely hollowed them out from the inside. They didn't lose him when they threw him out of the boardroom. They didn't lose him when Julian arrived from the boarding school. They didn't lose him when he turned 24. They had never actually had him. He had spent 10 long years standing perfectly still beside them, pouring his life into their foundations while they mistook simple physical proximity for love. He had served his contract to the very last second, giving them every single drop of devotion they didn't deserve, simply because he had promised an 8-year-old girl that she would never have to cry. Leo turned back to the window, his silhouette absorbing the white morning light. Behind the family, the heavy elevator doors slid open with a quiet mechanical hum. There were no dramatic exits. There were no shouting matches or grand legal settlements. One by one, the Vances turned and walked back into the silver car. Victoria stepped in with her head bowed. Chloe followed, her shoulders slumped. Mia pressed the journal against her chest, her eyes closed as she stepped over the threshold. The parents went last, their feet heavy, realizing that gravity had finally returned to their universe and that they were completely bankrupt. The elevator doors closed with a soft click, cutting off the past forever. The moment the silver panels met, the desaturated gray of the penthouse bled into a brilliant, unearthly gold. In Leo's immediate field of vision, the system HUD flared to life one final time, its text crisp, permanent, and beautiful. Contract status, complete. Host status, free. The holographic lines hung in the air for 3 seconds before dissolving into light, leaving the room entirely bare. Leo looked at the morning sun hitting the clean glass, took a deep, clear breath of the quiet air, and smiled. And for the first time since he was 7 years old, the smile belonged entirely to him. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end of the video. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe for more videos in the future. Comment below and let me know your thoughts. Your support helps the channel grow and is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one. Bye.